One of the things that really struck me about this announcement was the idea that Kroger and P&G issued a joint statement as opposed to putting out separate press releases. Did that surprise you? Welcome back to the Working Lunch. I'm Jack Crumley. A lot of big news going on. We got word about this yesterday afternoon. After 5 years of going, the LPGA's Kroger Queen City Championship, presented by P&G. Got to make sure I get that name right. They pay for the naming rights for that tournament. It's been going for 5 years, but its future now more in doubt as both Kroger and P&G, presenting sponsors on that golf tournament, announced that they are not going to renew their sponsorship. The guy who wrote that story for the Business Courier when it hit yesterday afternoon was Steve Watkins, and I'm happy to say that Steve Watkins joins us now here on The Crown on the Working Lunch. Steve, thank you for coming on. Appreciate your time. This is a big deal that has a lot of questions in the aftermath.
Absolutely, yeah. The big question will be, will the tournament continue in Cincinnati without the two main sponsors? Of course, Kroger, the title sponsor, and P&G as the presenting sponsor. And they were a big enough sponsor that they had their name in the actual title, as you said. You're talking about the big bankrolling companies of the tournament over the past 5 years. They're stepping away. It doesn't automatically mean the tournament will go away, but it certainly puts it in jeopardy if there is no sponsor and that sponsorship money behind it. Then it is very likely that it will leave.
Yeah, and it just happened at Makatiwa here just in the last few months. I know that tournament has bounced around to a couple different locations in the few years that it's been going. Is that unusual for a golf tournament? Did that maybe have any effect on Kroger and P&G making this announcement?
Yeah, I think it very likely had at least some effect. It may have shown, if nothing else, that the tournament just had not gotten its footing in the sense of having at least sort of a permanent home in Cincinnati. It started out the first 2 years at Kenwood Country Club. It moved up to TPC at Rivers Bend in Warren County for the next 2 years. That was 24 and 25. And then this year, of course, was played at Makatiwa. The tournament organizers love the idea of being at Makatiwa, which is in Bond Hill. It's right near the Norwood Lateral, very central to all of the tri-state area. And they like that idea a lot. However, the problem is, over time, fans are not used to going to a specific venue to go see the tournament. So by all accounts, the attendance has been pretty good, but that may have been an indication that it was still in some ways trying to find its footing.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about momentum and stuff, and I think, turnout last year hit about 50,000, and we still don't know what the turnout was for this year, but it was looking good even in spite of the rain, right?
Yeah, I had talked to the tournament executive director, Michael Taft, actually on the first day of the tournament, about 2/3 of the way through that day, and he had said things were still on track, and about a month before that, he had told me he was anticipating an increase, certainly pre-sales of tickets or early sales of tickets, I guess I should say, were ahead of last year. So things were on pace. As you mentioned, we don't have final figures this year, but certainly the first couple of days were strong. I think Sunday was very strong. Saturday had a fair amount of rain, and that likely held down attendance a bit on that day. But that happens, from one year to the next. You can't control that, obviously. So, in terms of attendance, the tournament was pretty strong.
Yeah, and of course, any sort of outdoor sporting event, that's kind of baked in. The uncertainty of the weather is always going to be baked into a sporting event. The LPGA knows that. One of the things that really struck me about this announcement was the idea that Kroger and P&G issued a joint statement as opposed to putting out separate press releases. Did that surprise you?
Not really, but you're right to point that out, because it is interesting that, obviously they're two separate companies. One could certainly make the decision without the other and say, hey, we want to pull out. You guys do what you want. But I think it kind of shows how in tandem the two were kind of throughout this process. Probably going back to the beginning 5 years ago, I'm guessing you've got what are the two biggest companies in Cincinnati, two of the Fortune 500 companies, And it would make sense that they would have kind of worked together to say, hey, if you're in, I'll be in, and vice versa. And that's for golf tournaments and sponsorships in general. That might be a little rare, but it's certainly not rare here because the Cincinnati Open ended up doing basically the same thing a few years ago when the ownership changed, and instead of Western and Southern being the sole title sponsor as they had been for more than 2 decades, the sponsorship the last few years has been 5 greater Cincinnati companies that have kind of banded together. Now, it doesn't mean one couldn't pull out and the others could still stay, but clearly a lot of these events, big sponsors do kind of work together to see if everybody is on the same page.
One of the things that struck me about Kroger's statement specifically talked about how they're going to be focusing their efforts in other areas that align with long-term priorities. Certainly, we have seen Kroger going through some changes recently with a new CEO, and we're going to talk about this Giant Eagle acquisition here coming up. But new leadership at the top for Kroger. They dialed back the wellness center, at least in terms, or the wellness expo, in terms of the local footprint. We had reporting that came out last year that P&G is going through some pretty significant layoffs that are still going on. How much of that figures into the idea of spending money to be the title sponsor on a LPGA tournament?
Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising if that played into it. And quite frankly, P&G has a new CEO as well. Shailesh Jejurikar took over January 1st. Now, he had been with P&G for a long time. I mean, I don't know that there was as much of a culture change as appears to be happening at Kroger. And so that may have had not quite as much of an effect, but it would not be surprising at all if at Kroger, under the new regime change, Greg Foran came in from the outside. First time Kroger's had a CEO from the outside. He came in February, took over. Some of the analysts I talked to then said, look for a lot of changes in the first couple of years. And this may or may not have been one of them, but it would not be surprising if this was one thing that he may have led the charge for, or at least put people in charge to look at and say, hey, what kind of return on investment are we getting? And if we're not getting enough that we can show, maybe we don't do this anymore. So, yeah. And it's always kind of hard to judge what your real return on investment is with some of these things.
Yeah, and then, of course, still the big question is what the LPGA is going to do. Your piece quotes a guy by telling you that they'll have an announcement later on this year?
Yeah, they tend to put out the new calendar. So it'd be the calendar for 2027 that has the locations and the events. They typically put that out very late in the year. I think he said November. And so it'll be a few months yet before we know officially. But in the meantime, what historically would happen in a situation like this is either you get a new title sponsor, or the LPGA could very well look elsewhere and say, we're going to take that date and move it to one of any number of cities that are kind of clamoring for an event like this. So typically, in almost every case, I think this year, every single LPGA tournament had a title sponsor. And in almost every single case, you need one in order to make it financially feasible, at least for the long run. LPGA has stepped in kind of briefly to carry it over for a year, let's say, if they have a pretty good idea that a company is going to come in. But if they don't see a path forward that's very clear, there's probably a good chance they will move it. So kind of the ball is in corporate Cincinnati's court at this point, and we'll see if somebody else can step up.
Yeah, I mean, other Fortune 500 companies are headquartered here. Probably a few doors that are going to get knocked on here in the coming days.